Yeah, hopefully you can see this. So my name's Shana Marsh. I'm the service manager for Hestia's Domestic and Sexual Violence Support Service. We were commissioned from June 2019 to provide support to survivors of domestic and sexual violence in the borough. And I'll tell you some of the stuff that we do in our service as well. But just quickly, the agenda for today, briefly, and I've only got 30 minutes, is to just sort of always visit the definition of abuse, because I think that's a really important part of, working in this field, is that we're always looking at what domestic abuse is. Prevalence of domestic violence in Newham. We'll look at safe spaces. So there's a face-to-face offer and an online offer. So we'll look at those in more detail and how we can encourage and support people to access them. We'll also look at signs of domestic abuse working remotely, as well as face-to-face. If we are still having face-to-face interactions, that's also important. And then we'll look at MARAC referral pathway and risk assessing. But like I mentioned, the other areas of support that we offer is for around sexual violence, female genital mutilation, so-called honour-based violence and forced marriage. Anybody that is currently sex working and wanting to exit, we also provide support there. We offer a peer support and community champions programme for our service users, as well as coordinating the specialist domestic abuse courts in Newham. And we also coordinate MARAC and offer training and other community development to raise awareness and to ensure that everybody has a very clear idea of what support is available. If there's any questions, if you just want to type it into the chat, and then when I know there's a Q&A session towards the end, and then we can revisit the questions there. So what is domestic abuse? So the cross-government definition of domestic abuse and domestic violence and abuse is any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. The abuse can encompass, but is not limited to, psychological, physical, sexual, financial and emotional. And also controlling behaviour is a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. Coercive behaviour is an act or pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish or frighten their victim. Now, although the definition does cover those that are 16 and above, our service specifically supports survivors that are 18 plus. If you do get cases where they're between 16 and or not yet 18, we would always advise that you would follow sort of child safeguarding protocols and make a referral into the MASH department. Sorry, I'm working from home, so I've got a 3-year-old now calling me. So always refer that into MASH. So if we just quickly look at the prevalence of DA in Newham. So from the beginning of COVID-19 restrictions, so around March the 23rd, one of the things we were asked to do by our public health commissioners in Newham was to report on referral data on a weekly basis. And the intention was obviously to keep track of what the cases are looking like in Newham, where the referrals are coming from, and what changes we're seeing over the course of lockdown. So we started off with offering a baseline figure. So we gave sort of the previous month's referral data, and then we were able to compare that throughout lockdown. The only thing that this didn't highlight, this report, is how many of those cases actually became active. So although we might have received 30 referrals in a week, we may have only taken on out of those 30 referrals, 10 to 20 cases. Various reasons why we might not have taken on the full 30. It might be that we've not been able to get hold of somebody, or we did get hold of them and they said they didn't want support. And bearing in mind, we are a consent-based support service. So all referrals have to have consent before they come to us. Generally, if they don't, we find that when we do make that first contact, people are really upset, and therefore it's unlikely that they're going to come forward for support again, which is why it is really important that those conversations before you make a referral happen. So here's just a little bit of a snapshot. So all the data, it wasn't just Hestia that provided the data, it was the refuges, it was MASH, it was all the other services including the police in the borough that reported on the prevalence of domestic abuse. But this is just a snapshot from our data. And as you can see, like I mentioned, we had sort of throughout February, this was our baseline. The most we would receive is 38, but sometimes those are also MARAC referrals. And generally, they are not sent into our service with consent because obviously the safeguarding nature of them. But you could see on average, we were receiving around between 32 and 38 referrals per week. What we saw in the first 2 weeks following the lockdown, so from sort of March the 23rd to the next 2 weeks there, was a dip in referrals. And we sort of put this down to many of the services having to adjust to working remotely, many survivors not actually interfacing with any of those services like they probably would have pre-lockdown, so schools, social services, and other places, like workplace, for example, or even come to the GP. So we saw a dip there, and then sort of started to crawl back up when we entered April, and then we sort of carried on with our baseline between April and May. And then at the end of May, when we saw the restrictions ease, that's when we saw an increase. So whereas most of the UK were reporting an increase in domestic abuse calls into domestic abuse helplines and reaching out to services, Newham didn't really see that until after the restrictions were eased. That was when people were able to get back out into the community, speak to people, and reach out to the services. During the time of lockdown, what our campaign UK Says No More did was roll out safe spaces. I'm sure many of you may have heard me speak about this previously. It was an initiative where Boots pharmacies, Morrison's and Superdrug pharmacies would offer their consultation rooms for survivors to be able to go there and make contact with specialist services. So that was something that we were sort of pushing as well during this period, where we saw that we weren't getting as many referrals as we expected. We knew it was because people could not get out and get the help. But as you can see, the increase sort of came between the months of June and July, and then towards August, we started to slip a little bit. I mean, this week here, 57, that was quite, luckily I was on leave that week, so I didn't really get to see exactly what those referrals were about, but that was one of our busiest weeks. And it looks a little bit like an anomaly. I don't think this was, I think this may have been, you know, an influx of MARAC referrals, as well as sort of, I called them panic referrals from service providers. We did see a huge increase in referrals without consent, which is why I called them panic referrals. I think a lot of services and professionals were getting really worried that we were in lockdown, and they just really wanted people to get the support. So they were making referrals to our service without actually speaking to the individuals. And what that meant was that a lot of those referrals didn't become active. So as much as the intentions were in the right place, unfortunately, the impact of that was that people were quite upset that the referral had been made and probably haven't come back to our service for support since then. Following August, we also expected that when children went back to school, we would also see an increase in referrals into our service, but actually we didn't. But I do know that MASH saw this increase throughout lockdown. So their data would be quite different to ours. And as a statutory service, all of those cases have to go to MASH, where children are involved. So their data looks a little bit different to ours. It looks a little more consistent that the increase started at lockdown and carried on throughout. And again, now we're in November. This time again, we haven't seen an increase yet, but of course we expect restrictions to be eased next week. So we may very well see another increase. So like I said, whilst nationwide there was an increase of calls into domestic abuse helplines, Newham did not see that increase until much further down the line. But one of the things we did see as a result was more new incidents of domestic abuse. So in some instances, lockdown was actually the catalyst to new domestic abuse. And what we mean by that is where people would have had an outlet pre-lockdown, where they could have left the house and they could have gone out and, they've had an argument, they could have gone out, they weren't able to do that. And that meant that all of that was happening and there was nowhere for anybody to escape to. So we saw an increase in more physical abuse for maybe the first time, as well as verbal and verbal and controlling abuse during that period. So these were all escalations, and that was a direct result of COVID-19 and people not being able to get out of the house. And we can go on to further explore that with Women's Aid, who reported a 40% reduction in refuge vacancies between the 23rd of March and the 31st of May. This was because people could not be moved on. So where families were staying at refuges, maybe there was a plan in place that they would be moved on into social housing or moved on by into other private rented schemes. That wasn't possible because of lockdown. So there were less refuge vacancies available. That impacted us because we had people that when eventually they did need to come, they did reach out for support and they advised that they wanted to flee and they wanted to be moved to a refuge. There was very limited refuge spaces to place people. Refuge reported a 50% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline and a 300% plus increase in visits to its helpline website. So again, this was more people reaching out to speak to somebody about what they were experiencing. Before, they may have confided in a GP, they may have confided in a friend or another professional, maybe somebody at school. But where that wasn't available, they were going into the helpline and looking online. I think this gives us a really clear picture of actually the scope of domestic abuse, what the real figures are. Because again, we know that much of domestic abuse that happens goes unreported. Previously, we were looking at 35 instances of abuse before somebody reached out and got help. Now we're seeing around an average of 50 instances of abuse before somebody's reaching out for help. So this also could be part of the impact of COVID. So 90% of respondents currently experiencing domestic violence said COVID had a negative impact in at least one way. 61% of survivors at home of abusers said that the abuse worsened during lockdown, with perpetrators using lockdown to prevent victims from leaving. So again, where women would have fled, they weren't able to, and there's probably a lot of guilt and shaming for them wanting to leave during the pandemic. And over 68% of victims felt they had nowhere to turn to. And over 53% of survivors advised that their children had also witnessed more abuse. So this is the impact, not on just directly on the victims, but we know the impact this has on children that witness domestic abuse. We know that 55% of children that witness abuse will go on to experience abuse or perpetrate abuse in their adult life. We know that a third of children that witness abuse or experience abuse at home will also experience another type of abuse. So we know that this impact is huge on children specifically, as well as the victims, the adult victims that are experiencing it. So like I mentioned previously, Safe Spaces was rolled out during lockdown to give people a safe space to go to speak to specialist services and get support. So I believe it's all Boots pharmacies, Superdrug and Morrison's that are enrolled, but also independent pharmacies are able to sign up to this initiative as well. And following on from that, UK Says No More again launched another initiative, which is an online partnership with Royal Mail, eBay, Parcel Force and the Ministry of Defence, as well as some other services. And this is also Safe Spaces Online. So what that looks like is you go onto the website, and at the bottom of the page, where usually all the other sort of contact information is held, you'll see UK Says No More logo. When you click that, it brings you to a page where you can get advice, where you can look at risk sort of assessment. You can see what support is available in your local area. And the good thing about this is it doesn't save on your browser history. So that's also really important. So this allows people, when they are at home and they're not even able to get out of the house, they can look for support online by going to these websites and scrolling at the bottom, and UK Says No More, which is a blue circle right at the bottom of the page, and that will bring them, link them into a safe online portal to get advice and guidance. Okay. So looking at how we can look at the signs of abuse. So this is some of the signs that you might expect to see if you are working face-to-face with somebody. I'm sure many of us know it, but again, it's always important to revisit it, refresh it in your mind. So somebody might seem afraid or anxious to please their partner if they're experiencing abuse. They might go along with everything their partner says and does. They might check in often with their partner to report where they are and what they're doing. They might receive frequent harassing phone calls from their partner. Again, if this is something you're seeing, that you're working with somebody or you're in have an appointment with somebody, but they're constantly deferring to their partner because they're not making the decisions themselves. Maybe that's something we look at. And again, just to pick up again on what Sabina said, try to avoid, where possible, using family or friends as interpreters. It is always best to have a third party do the interpreting. Again, especially if we suspect that there's abuse but not really clear on who the abusers are, that's one way that we can make sure we're safeguarding that person. So they might also talk about their partner's temper, jealousy or possessiveness. They might have frequent injuries with the excuse of accidents. They might frequently miss work, school or social occasions without explanation. They might dress in clothing designed to hide bruises or scars. So they might wear long sleeves in the summer or sunglasses indoors, anything that's not really appropriate for the weather. They may also always have their partner with them. They might look for a lot of assurance from others about making decisions. They might forget a lot of things like dates, times, and specific events. And another thing as well, they might be really overly apologetic about things that maybe in ordinary circumstances isn't really a big deal, but they might feel, and they might get really emotional about that, and just really, really be apologetic. And that's something that we should also look out for. Alternatively, they might not do any of these, but there might be things that they say, and you just have to sort of pick up and read between the lines and explore some of that with them. So when we're working remotely, it is very, very difficult because we don't get to see people, we don't get to see their facial expressions, we don't get to see their body language, and we don't get to see if there's any obvious marks of abuse. So one of the things that we're learning, and I'm sure we're all learning during this new time and new way of working, is how to look out for some of those signs. So first thing is, did the person you call answer the phone? That might seem like a really small thing, but if you're calling a patient and their partner or their other family member is constantly answering the phone on their behalf, asking who it is, why you're calling, we need to maybe look at that as well and find out why that's the case. Or alternatively, they may not answer the phone, but they might be in the background asking the person you're speaking to who is on the phone and what are you talking about. You know, wanting to know everything that you're discussing with that person on the phone. Is the person you're speaking to constantly running things by their partner or family member before making a decision? Again, similar to what we just looked at in sort of the signs that we might see face to face, is that that lack of confidence, not being able to really make a decision for themselves, relying on somebody else to tell them what to do. That could be a sign of controlling behaviour. That could be a sign of not wanting to make a decision to upset that person, partner or family member. And it's really important to remember that it's not always partners that are abusers, it can be family members. So we can be looking at familial abuse as well. Is a partner or family member taking the call on their behalf without consulting them? So do you hear the person you're actually trying to speak to saying to that person, give me the phone, let me speak to them? And the person, the potential abuser that you're speaking to, is not letting them speak on the phone. And again, is somebody else making decisions for them? And I'm sure we probably see this a lot when we're working with, or when we're with patients that don't speak English and they've got a family member there interpreting. And that is why we say to avoid that, because sometimes we see that they don't actually consult the person that you're asking the question to. They just answer the question for them. So that's another thing that we can look out for. It can be very challenging. I completely appreciate that. But if we pick up on these things and explore it in a safe space, when we're able to, it might be that you might invite them in for a face-to-face appointment next time. If you know that you've got a review in a couple of weeks, invite them for face-to-face and see if we can really see what's going on. We looked at how does domestic abuse impact on children. So many children exposed to domestic abuse in the home can also be victims of physical and emotional abuse, and children who witness domestic abuse or are victims of abuse themselves are at serious risk of long-term physical and mental health problems. So children who witness domestic abuse between parents may also have a greater risk of being violent in their future relationships. And again, these are some of the stats I just spoke about. So 1 in 5 children have been exposed to domestic abuse. And also 1 in 5 teenagers have been physically abused by a boyfriend or girlfriend. So quickly moving on to risk assessing. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the MARAC process, but MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, will hear high-risk cases of domestic abuse. We know it's high risk because we've completed this assessment, which gives us a score at the end of the assessment, which tells us whether this case is high risk or standard to medium. So it's a universal risk assessment, and it can be used by both statutory and voluntary agencies. And it's a series of questions. There's 24 questions that you asked, yes, no answers, with boxes for additional detail. If somebody says yes to 14 or more of those questions, it's high risk. But we'll quickly look at as well in the next slide how we can make a professional judgment call as well. But before you do this, you always need to establish how much time that person has to talk to you, and is it safe? And if it's not safe, what are safe contact details? Find out where the perpetrator and the children are, and explain why you're asking these questions and how it relates to the MARAC. I know as GPs, you don't have a huge amount of time, you know, in your appointments, you're quite limited. But if you can get some idea of what's going on for somebody, it might help make the best referral for them. So again, don't use family or friends to translate. That's really important. Use non-gender specific terms like partner or ex-partner, because we also want to create a safe space for LGBT victims who are accessing support. So yeah, like I said, MARAC assesses high-risk cases of domestic abuse, and we know a case is high risk based on the DASH-RIC assessment completed. With 14 or more, then we know we can determine that that is a high-risk case. However, a case may have high-risk elements, and although they may not reach the 14-mark score, we can make a referral based on professional judgment. And some things to consider, if you're not sure, does the AP, which is alleged perpetrator, have access to weapons? So if that person, if the alleged perpetrator has access to weapons, i.e. guns, knives, not only would we probably report that to the police, But we would also probably look at making a MARAC referral for that case. Have there ever been any threats in the past to kill the victim or family member or any other family members? Has the AP breached bail conditions or injunctions in the past? Has the AP served any time in prison for violent offences? Has the AP attempted to strangle, choke or suffocate the victim? And has the AP ever harmed any pets? And that might seem like a really strange question. Why are we asking if there's ever been any harm to pets? But we know that generally, if somebody is going to harm a pet, I'm sure there's loads of studies that can verify this, then we know that the risk of them harming another human life is quite high. This is all forms part of intimidation and abuse in the wider context as well. So if they have said yes to any of these questions, these are all questions on the DASH assessment. If they have said yes to any of these questions, even if they haven't said yes to 14 or more, then we will probably look at that as a high-risk case and make a referral. If in doubt, you can always contact Hestia for any advice and guidance on any cases that you want to refer, and we'll be able to guide you with it. So just quickly, some information around safety planning. And this is helpful. If somebody discloses to you that they want to leave, these are some of the things that we would look at before. We would never advise somebody to just pack their bags and leave without fully planning how they're going to do that. Because we know abuse will escalate when a victim decides to leave. Because we know abuse is about power and control. And the minute the perpetrator loses power and control or feels like that is slipping, that is when we see the escalation. So always plan in advance and consider the following. So if it's possible to have copies of all ID, you can send photos via email to a key worker, professional involved, or a trusted friend. And that's because we know that often perpetrators will take documents, ID, so that that person cannot leave, so that they're stuck. But if we can get photocopies, that is definitely a starting point. And many refugees will accept that as well. Have a grab bag packed with ID and a small amount of clothes. So nothing that would be noticeable if the abuser went looking. So you may want to leave the bag with a trusted neighbour, friend, so not a mutual friend, or the children's school. Because the idea is that when you are leaving, everything has to seem normal. There's no changes in your routine. There's nothing that's going to make the perpetrator look at you and wonder what's going on. So if you leave it with the school, for example, and you usually pick the children up, you're able to encourage them, go to the school, pick the children up, we'll get you a cab from the school. And also it has to be at a time where the perpetrator is not around. Ensure mobile phone is charged for obvious reasons. You need to be able to call either your key worker or the refuge where you're going, or friend or family member, wherever it is that you're going to. Plan a route out in advance and rehearse it, and plan to leave when your partner is not around for a while, i.e. when they're at work or appointment or shopping. Now, if somebody isn't ready to leave, but we want to support them to keep safe at home, here's also some things that we can advise. Avoid enclosed spaces in the home, such as bathrooms, cupboards, rooms that you can be trapped in. So if something was to happen and they're fearing that there is about to be an incident, then we would always say avoid enclosed spaces. Avoid kitchen, garages and sheds where objects can be used as weapons, such as knives and household tools. For obvious reasons, we don't want the perpetrator picking anything up and harming that person with it. Decide where you can go in an emergency, so maybe a friend, a neighbour or a local police station, and save small amounts of money so you have some cash for when or if you decide to leave. Another thing as well is if something does happen, we try to say if you're able to leave the house and get into a public open space. And just lastly, on refuge support, quick disclaimer, we do not have any special access to refuges. I know we get a lot of referrals, and a lot of those referrals just say, you know, so and so needs a refuge. We have to access refuge spaces like everybody else would. It's on a first come, first served basis. So we can look online and we can see what refuges are available, and we can definitely support a client to access them. But in some instances where there's eligibility criteria being met, the best option and the safest option may be to approach local authority emergency housing. And also a refuge is an option for everybody. Everybody wants to go to a refuge. And what we don't want to start doing is putting victims of domestic abuse in places they don't want to be, because the inevitability is that they will return to the perpetrator or the family home where the abuse is occurring. And it's always important to remember that not every refuge is suitable for all individual needs. So we need to consider, if it's a single person, is there a single refuge available? Do they have complex needs? Is there a single space with complex needs available? They're all different types of refuges. If the children have any special needs, you know, can the refuge support those needs of the children? There's so many things that we need to consider when looking for a refuge space, and it can take some time. And like I said, it has to be client-led. So if we force any of these choices onto people, we run the risk of them returning to the perpetrator. I think that is me. So this is just our referral information. If anybody wants to make a referral or you want to get any information from us, this is just to know, it's referrals newham.dsv and info.newham.dsv at hestia.org, but the number is correct. So yeah, that is me. I'm done. Thank you for listening.
Hi, thanks so much, Shana, for that. That was really interesting. If anybody has any burning questions, then we can maybe do a couple now. If not, we can leave it for afterwards. I'm just pulling up the chat. Nothing on chat yet. So if anyone has anything, we can do that. Or if not, okay, well, let's move on to Jasmine, who's come from the maternity unit. So I'm going to mute and hand over to Jasmine Doodle. Thank you.
Hi all, I'm just gonna thank you for having me, and gosh, I feel, oh my god, following on from Shana's presentation, I hope that is as interesting. I'm just gonna share my screen, so if you bear with me a second. I feel like I'm a bit all over the place. So thanks for having me, like I said. So my name's Jasmine Doodle. I'm the named midwife for safeguarding here at Newham Hospital. So I was asked to discuss about the impact of COVID-19 and what's happened within maternity services. So just as a little bit of a breakdown, I have gone into COVID as general and what's happened within maternity, and then linked it into safeguarding, just so that you've got a bit of a setting of the scene. So just a bit of background for those of you that don't know, but I'm sure you are all aware about Newham Hospital. Our maternity service delivers around about 6,000 babies per year. So we are one of the busiest units in the country. So we don't only just provide care we provide care in Newham Hospital, but also we've got a standalone birth centre that is based in Barking, which is IG11. And we also provide care within our community setting. So that will be within Barking and also in Newham, in the borough of Newham as well. We don't just provide care to women that live in the London Borough of Newham, but also surrounding boroughs such as Barking, Havering and Redbridge. But because women have a choice to have their care or receive care wherever they wish to, we do welcome women from other boroughs. So we do have quite a few links with other boroughs as well, and work with other boroughs as well in terms of agencies. Just in terms of demographics, I'm sure that all of you guys are aware of this. I mean, Newham is diverse in its community, and experiencing high deprivation and overcrowding and housing, and I'm sure yourselves as GPs have seen that time and time again with families that you see in your surgeries. But just linking it in with in terms of the BAME population. So in the last census, Newham has a 71% population from BAME groups. And also, interestingly, from the last census, it was considered the second most deprived local borough within London and England, but since then has now moved up to the fourth most deprived borough within London. So just setting out a scene there. And I don't need to go over this, but just about stats that have come out that you're all more than aware of, is that BAME groups have more adverse effects from COVID, and Public Health England has also shown stats that BAME groups are more likely to be diagnosed with COVID, and again that is seen within the Office of National Statistics as well, and linking that within deprived areas as well. Just interestingly, between the period of March and May, and that's 2020 this year, we had the second highest in London in terms of COVID related to death rates. So I think that was quite an interesting stat as well. So what is COVID-19 and pregnancy? What's the link? So between the period of March and August 2020, in Newham maternity, we had 154 women that tested positive for COVID-19. Now, and again, you're all highly aware of this, some of these women are asymptomatic, some of them were coming in with new persistent cough, or certainly showing signs of high fever. Now, the issues that we had with high fever is that sometimes women after delivery, they do produce or certainly develop a high fever. So sometimes we were on that cusp wondering whether it was COVID or whether it was a natural reaction to the labour itself, or certainly if there was other things that were going on, such as sepsis. Pregnant women did not appear more susceptible as a consequence to the infection, and also there was no evidence in terms of transmission through fluid and breast milk. So what happened within maternity within that time? So we had to change, we had to really respond to COVID like all of our services did. We went from swabbing women, we decided to swab women who needed to be admitted into any areas of our ward at any stage of the pregnancy. We also then reconfigured our wards, creating a maternity admissions ward, and that was a self-contained ward which comprised a mixture of single and side rooms. And the whole purpose of this was the women that came in that were being swabbed or certainly had symptoms of COVID were kept there. It was almost like a waiting area, if you like, just waiting for the results to come through, and then they were moved on to the cold areas back then, or green areas as they're known to now, just so that we were reducing any risk of transmissions within the ward. Women were asked screening questions on the day before attending their scheduled appointments, which also included any members of the household having to self-isolate. As we know, in Newham, there is a lot of women that are living with families, and certainly extended families, so that was something that we had to make quite specific when asking questions as well. And at this point in the first wave, only women were permitted to attend their appointments, and that was in line with the national advice, so that we were able to adhere with any social distancing as well, and also reduce any risk of COVID within any of our areas. During the antenatal period, so that's the booking appointments and 16-week appointments were all conducted virtually, so normally over the phone. We weren't so advanced in getting virtual appointments through say Teams or anything like that at that point, but the remainder of the other appointments were face to face, so we had a space where women were seen on their own. During the intrapartum period, women would be assessed, and then once they were in established labour, they were admitted to have one birth partner to support them during that time. During the postnatal period, all inpatient visiting ceased to reduce the risk to women and their babies in terms of COVID, and postnatal visits, day one was conducted virtually. day 5 and day 10 were all face-to-face, and these were either in the home or certainly within community clinics. So what does this look like for safeguarding? So giving you a bit of a setting scene of what had gone on. We at Newham, which some of you, I know some GPs are aware, but all of you might not be aware of, we have a vulnerable women's team called the ACORN team, and they care for women with complex safeguarding needs, or certainly women where there's teenage pregnancies, where there is asylum, if women are asylum seekers, certainly families asylum seekers, and if there's any mental health, and certainly everything else that comes with safeguarding. So if there's any social care involvement that's involved, child protection, child in need cases. So we're quite lucky here that we've got a dedicated team of specialist midwives. Now, they had conducted their virtual, they had some virtual appointments, certainly from booking. They did that. However, because we were quite aware of safeguarding and certainly any complex needs, we felt that we had to keep this team quite separate from what the generic maternity team were doing. So, for instance, we actually said that if there were any complex safeguarding needs, they were definitely identified prior to booking, that the midwives would conduct a face-to-face consultation. And of course, that was taken into consideration, the screening that the women had to go through. Also, that team, again, it was different from the generic maternity team, was they conducted face-to-face appointments throughout the antenatal and postnatal period. And that was definitely for families that were under assessment from social care, where there was a child in need plans that were in place for the unborn and the older children. And again, if there was child protection concerns and if there were plans in place for those families. And just actually going on from what Shana was saying, it links into Shana's presentation. Although it was well documented, and we knew this through the media and certainly other platforms, that there was a concern with the rise in domestic abuse during the national lockdown measures. In maternity, our referrals didn't differ that much. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. Most of our referrals that come into the safeguarding team, and certainly within the vulnerable women's team, are domestic abuse in nature, whether that be women that disclose, or certainly that there's other agencies that highlight us to that fact, such as social care, who would have may have received a referral in from police or other agencies. We normally see it fluctuating between about 10 or 11 referrals a month during the COVID period. So for March, we saw 9 referrals during that time, and April it was 8, and then certainly in that time it stayed quite consistent. And also just going on from that, I think there was a bit of myself, and certainly because we're part of Barts Health, which is a bigger trust, and we have our 2 sister sites, that's the Royal London and Whipps Cross. I was certainly in touch with my counterparts on those 2 sites to see, oh my gosh, what is going on here? This is what they're saying nationally. However, in Newham, I'm not seeing an increase in the referrals, and certainly that was true for those sites as well. They hadn't seen an increase, and we'd also taken this to our national safeguarding forum, the midwives, and they had also said nationally they hadn't seen the increase. And I think, just like as Shana had pointed out, I think we were ready to see there was going to be an increase, or sort of thought that there would be an increase, certainly when the lockdown measures came out, when we came out of those measures. In terms of what happened in terms of us and multi-agency working, our discharge planning meetings were all conducted virtually, and I would have to say very smoothly actually, and they were conducted in a really timely manner, actually more timely than it was to get all professionals together coming to the hospital is what we used to do. So that was using platforms such as Skype or MS Teams. our strap meetings and initial child protection meetings all took place virtually as well, as did, like Shana was talking about, MARAC. So we as maternity safeguarding attend the MARAC meetings. Certainly if there's women or families that have unborns, there's pregnant women on there. All of these meetings very quickly went onto virtual platforms, and it actually worked really well. I think I would say initially there may be some teething problems, but actually now it's quite smooth in the running. The other concern that we had during this time is about court proceedings for unborn. So if social care were going to court or had legal advice to go to court because the risks to the unborn was so high, it was about how was that going to take place. Now normally I would say it's about a week in all that we have to wait for a court date and for discharge planning meetings to take place and seeing where a safe discharge was going to be for the unborn or baby when they're born. During the initial lockdown, I'd say probably about the end of March, when we had 2 court proceedings going on for unborns, this took considerably longer. It was nearly, I think women were on our wards for just over 2 weeks, and I think that was a teething problem. I think because courts, again, all of us are new to the virtual working and everyone's trying to get things in place. And for us, certainly, if you can imagine being in a pandemic, what we're trying to do is ensure that mothers and babies, if they can, be discharged as safely as possible, certainly if medically they are indicated to be discharged. It was quite worrying that how long these women may or may not have been exposed to COVID. So it was quite an anxious time for all of us. I'd like to say since then, it has gone back to normal in terms of the time scale. So we are still looking at a week until we get a court date, but that's something that we've all lived with, and we've all put in plans in place to reduce the risk of COVID, especially now with the swabbing as well. So we're a bit more confident in that. Just going on, have the changes been positive or negative? I think everyone, and I think in every sector, can take away some. There's been some negatives, but certainly there have been some positives when it's come to COVID. So when we were talking to midwives about safeguarding, so going back to especially what Shana was saying in her presentation, where you have a person face to face with you, you can pick up on key signs, can't you, as well as what a person is saying. There is body language, there's certain other key signs that you pick up on. The midwives are saying it was so difficult when you were conducting, especially the booking appointment, where a majority of these safeguarding questions are asked. One was about whether they could verify if the client was alone. They would ask, but always you are going on what that person's telling you. There was no way of verifying whether they were on their own and whether those questions were safe to be asked. And certainly if the woman is saying that she's on her own and she's answering the question, you weren't too sure whether that was you weren't getting the correct picture of what was going on. So on from that, what we decided was, because midwives felt that asking the questions, like I said, they were missing vital signs, it wasn't triggering any professional curiosity. It was just literally like, we were asking, is there any domestic abuse? Has there been any history, current domestic abuse perpetrated by anybody? Like I said, it was just a yes or no answer that they were getting, and like I said, with the vital body language or signs that they were picking up with normally with the face-to-face appointments, they were feeling that their professional curiosity wasn't being triggered. So professional curiosity, as I'm sure that you're all aware, for those of you that aren't, is about if somebody's saying something, is just being a bit more curious about why they've answered a certain way. And following on from their booking, so that was just that. But following on from their booking appointment, women were asked to pick up their handheld notes. So it was at that stage, and because nobody could come with them, it was at that stage that the midwives felt more confident in asking safeguarding questions around domestic abuse and everything else, and also were able to risk assess women because they were seen on their own. And midwives have also said that actually having women attend their appointments on their own have made it easier to ask them certain safeguarding questions without having to be creative in, you know, trying to get a woman on their own, which sometimes could raise some suspicion. So it's been positive in that way. This is just a quick client story that we had during the COVID period, and I thought it was just nice to put it into perspective. So this was a woman that had her virtual booking, had answered all the questions, no, you know, in terms of domestic abuse, but once she'd attended our unit to pick up her book, it was at that point when the midwife asked her the safeguarding questions again, and certainly related to domestic abuse. She disclosed that there was severe domestic abuse towards her that was perpetrated by the father of the unborn. Other issues around that: she was a recent immigrant into the UK on a spousal visa, which she was really worried about. And also the other issue that we had was that she spoke a very rare language. I think it was Solinki. Which was something that certainly nobody in our maternity services had heard of. But we were quite lucky because we've got quite a diverse workforce. One of our healthcare assistants actually spoke the language, and we used her. So that's going again to what Shana was saying about using, well, not that we had family members there, but using somebody else to interpret what the woman's saying and having an understanding. And also they were known to social care. So once they'd identified the risks and the fact that the mum had said that she wanted to leave the relationship, she wanted to go, the booking staff, the midwife, escalated to our safeguarding team. There was referrals done to our vulnerable women's team, and the safeguarding midwife did some joint up working with social care. As you can imagine, this always happens, as most of you know, on a Friday, you know, 3 o'clock, when you're trying to, you know, get everything in place. This is one of those stories. So we were really battling against the clock here. So the team did well. So the impact, so mum actually, because there was such good working between safeguarding maternity, the midwife, and also social care, so the multi-agency working, she was placed in safe accommodation that evening. Safety plan was put in place. And then later on, mum was moved to a permanent accommodation. Her maternity care was also transferred over to the local hospital where the mum's new address was, and and obviously social care carried out an assessment. So there, it's just saying about good partnership working. Now, interestingly, Emma, you were talking about flags. So we have flag alerts on any women that we know that there's safeguarding concerns. So we will put that if other agencies have informed us, certainly GPs or social care or any other agencies, health visitors have informed us about any concerns. So that was all on the system. There was prompt response from all agencies that are involved, and handover. And I think in terms of this, with the learning points, it was again about seeing that client on her own. So again, although the virtual booking was taking place, she's saying she's alone. She's telling you, yes, she's safe. No, there's no domestic abuse, but she felt safe enough when she came into our service, actually having that face-to-face contact with us, that yes, there was an issue, and she cried, and she needed help, and that's where we became involved. Now, on the back of that, we have have a new initiative within our maternity department. So we have introduced our domestic abuse barcode. So as you can see, it looks like any other barcode if anybody was to pick this up, because like you've all said, Emma said it, and like Shana has said, it's about ensuring that we're discreet, but also making sure that that woman has a safe space to speak to us, but also making sure that she's safe when she goes home. So we do not document anything within the woman's handheld notes. Anything to do with safeguarding is all on the woman's electronic record. The only professionals that have access to that involved in her care at that time have access to. So this was something that we came up with, or certainly this has been around. I think it's been a national initiative that we bought locally. So the number on the bottom is the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. So women, once they come and pick up their books, or certainly we've started face-to-face bookings now, are directed to the back of the book. As you can see, there's a picture there of the back of the book. That's where the barcode is. They are shown this and told at any time during their pregnancy. They can talk to their midwife, because throughout that period they'll be seeing the midwife, but certainly they have got the domestic abuse helpline, which they have accessible on their notes 24 hours. But also the fact that actually it looks like a normal barcode. It looks like something that we would use for our own stats, so it's very discreet. This at the moment has only been rolled out in our antenatal period. We are looking to roll it out in the postnatal period, because we do take these books back, because these are legal documents. So we are talking about now putting it in the maybe the red books, you know, for the babies, because that is something that the women keep. And as you may or may not know, domestic abuse in pregnancy is something that certainly, if it hasn't been happening, if it's not there before pregnancy, is certainly that does happen during pregnancy. And if it has been there before, there are stats out there to show you that it does the intensify and certainly increases in its nature. So we want to make sure that women are safe and they have access to services as they've needed. So that's a new initiative that we rolled out from July time, and we're going to start doing audits and seeing how well it's been received. But yeah, we will be looking at rolling it out in the postnatal period. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was really interesting. I'll pass back to Emma now.
Thank you.
I've got, yeah, I think I'm there. There we go. Yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks so much. I'm just going to check the chat. If anyone's got any questions for either Shana or Jasavir, please do feel free to pop them down. Some really interesting comments. I was recently at a Bart's Health sort of feedback, and they were saying actually that in the last month they had noticed an increase in disclosures about domestic abuse, and actually how much easier it was to be able to talk to women about it now that they're only attending alone without partners. So I think we do have to hang on to the good things that come out of that, but I do think that potentially from a ease of being able to disclose about domestic abuse, that appointment with the midwife is a really important one. So I thought, yeah, that was really interesting. And it was, you know, when you're talking about injuring animals, about whether perpetrators have injured animals, I used to work at Holloway. I was one of the GPs there, and animal cruelty is something that is a risk factor for murder, actually. So that it is a definite, it's a negative prognostic indicator for violence. So it's interesting about it being talked about. I'm not surprised it's being talked about in this forum. I'm just going to go back. So I don't. There hasn't been any questions that have come up. Sabina, have you got anything that you'd like to talk about? And then if there are still no questions, we'll stop. I'll just hand over to Sabina.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shana and Jasvir. Actually, I do have a question that I wonder may be helpful for all our colleagues on the call. And I know Jasvir touched on it partially, was asylum seeking or difficulties with recourse to public funds. And obviously that's in a specific cohort of women who are pregnant, but there are many individuals, not just women, but men, although we know women are disproportionately affected, but we need to bear in mind that men can be victims of domestic abuse. And also we need to be mindful of the fact that we have a lot of the population who are non-binary or identify as male or identify as female. So we have to be sensitive to this and the potential honour-based abuse that can follow this as well. But if they had no recourse to public funds, or if they were on a spousal visa, or they didn't have documents, because Shana was talking about, you know, the safety planning. Obviously, this is a barrier to seeking access because you already are in fear of authorities. Do you have any recommendations for our colleagues on the call?
Yeah, so from our perspective, if a case is referred to us and we're working with a woman, like as you say, mostly it's women, but it can also be men, and they're on a spousal visa, we can apply for something called a destitute domestic violence concession, which would give them sort of emergency access to public funds for about 3 months, and then an application is sent off to Home Office, and then their decision is made about sort of their status going forward. But generally as well, if they've got children, it's usually quite straightforward. So we can apply for that. We did have a case where we had a woman that was here. She was from the EU, so she's from Romania, but she didn't have, her perpetrator had taken her documents and hadn't returned them. And we really, really struggled with that case because we really couldn't find any way to get her documents. She just wanted to return home, but she couldn't obviously do that without any of her ID. So we worked with her for around 2 to 3 months, and we went everywhere to try and get support for this individual. We looked at referring her into the national referral mechanism because there were parts of her story that were echoing that she'd been trafficked here. So we were looking at maybe getting her engaged with modern day slavery services, which Hestia also operate. Sadly, she wasn't accepted into the national referral mechanism for that. So that was sort of a dead end. We then went to Southall Black Sisters, who were able to provide, they have a no recourse fund. So they were able to provide some sort of temporary, I think it's for about 6 weeks funding, so that we could keep her somewhere whilst we sort of were going back and forth to Romanian embassy to try and get some documents in place. And we did eventually, for her case, manage to get her some emergency documents which allowed her to travel back home, but that had an expiry date. So it can be very difficult, but it isn't impossible. But I guess the key thing is really based on each individual case. Like I say, where there's children involved and there's no recourse, social services generally have a duty there. The tricky part is when there aren't children involved and every service says, well, no, we can't take on this case. Adult social services won't touch the case. And so it does depend on case by case, but there are those options available, which we would obviously advocate on their behalf to support them with.
No, thank you, Shana. I think it's really important that we do recognise that, yes, it is a gender, it's gender heavy, affected by women, but also it's an indiscriminate abuse, and anyone can be a victim, anyone can be a perpetrator, and that just because they don't have access to public funds, or that they're an undocumented migrant or whatever, asylum seeker, or we can still refer them in. And I think that's the take-home message for me, and wanted to reassure to our colleagues on the call. Are there any more questions? Or Emma, do you have anything else to add or ask?
No, No, nothing particular from me. Just to remind people that if you do know that if you're not sure that the Hestia offer advice service, the other people to come through can come through to me and Sabina. Just to encourage people, if you are involved in cases, I guess the only other thing to mention is for those victims who do not accept a referral on to another organisation. I think as GPs, it's really important that we're risk assessing them, and I think there's a lot of risk assessment now is done by Hestia or other, if you work in other areas, maybe perhaps Iris. And so I think sometimes as GPs we've kind of got out of the habit of doing a risk assessment, but it's really, really important if patients don't engage with or don't agree to onward assessment, that we are doing a risk assessment on them, and if we need to, linking them up with MARAC, and that we are asking those questions. I was involved in a domestic homicide where the patient hadn't engaged with the service, and the GP really was not aware of the extent and the severity of the domestic abuse, and so that is something that I'd really encourage people to do. So there's the dash, the DB1 dash assessment, and if you are involved with people who don't want onward a referral, you can still call for advice. So that you're able to provide some form of safety planning, and potential access to other services. So I would, if that cohort actually, so people without children and who don't want onward referral, they're very risky, and they're kind of they would fall under our care and responsibility. So just be very aware and make sure that if you're not sure, that you're calling in other agencies to help support you with them.
Yeah, I would say in the consultation, sometimes if you have a look on the Safe Lives website, they've got, I think, a flow chart and a risk assessment for the dash, because obviously if it's something you're familiar with and you've got a patient in there in the consultation with you. I know Hestia have a I am right, Shana, aren't I? You do have a website, don't you, Hestia? And so there are lots of online tools. If you are in that consultation, you think, oh, hang on a minute, I need to have a look at something, as well as the resources we've put out.
Can I just quickly add, just briefly, just with MARAC referrals, it's really important to know that you don't need consent to make a MARAC referral. So if you do complete an assessment and the case is very clearly high risk, that you can make a referral into MARAC without that individual's consent. We would look at that in a very similar way that we would look at raising a safeguarding alert. And secondly, there is the Bright Sky app that you can also encourage people to download. Somebody asked me earlier on, sort of, what do you do if you suspect? You can see that there are some signs, but you don't really get to see that patient again. I would recommend, just if we have suspicions, encouraging them to download the Bright Sky app. It can be disguised as a weather app on the phone, and when you hold it down, then it will show that it's sort of the other content in there. It gives you an "Am I at risk?" questionnaire. It can signpost you to local services for support in your area, and also there's a journal on there, so you can actually document incidents. And that's something that's really useful if the case does go to court. You've got a sort of history of evidence to show a pattern of behaviour. So that's really key. So yeah, key thing: MARAC does not need consent.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. I didn't know about the Bright Sky app, so we'll definitely start talking a bit more about that. So I think there aren't any further questions. It's 2:20. I think in the absence of more questions, then we'd just like to say a really big thank you to Shana and Jasabir for coming to talk to us. I think the presenters have just opened a poll, so do give us your feedback. Safeguarding Leeds, we will see you on either the 7th or 8th of December. The rest of the GPs on here, if you're interested in training, there will be training coming out and being advertised soon, but that will be for the end of January. And we lovely to see you today virtually, and we look forward to seeing you all at some point in the future. So thanks very much. Thanks for your time. We really appreciate it. And thanks to our speakers. Many thanks.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you then. Bye-bye.
Thank you.